Well, hello and welcome to another video from input fragment to result fragment, right? So to do that, we can use fragment transaction, but now it won't be efficient to use fragment manager when we have the power of navigation component library. So why not to use that? So we already have set up the libraries dependencies inside our Gradle file. So let's dive into that. Now, first of all, we'll need to create a nav graph for our navigation. So right click on this res folder, resource folder, new Android resource file, and I'll create nav graph. So I'll name it nav graph, and the resource type will be navigation. So it will create another folder for us, which will be named navigation. So once it's created, you can see a little plus icon here. So we can click on that and we can add the fragments in our nav graph. So we'll add input fragment and result fragment. And as we added this input fragment, you can see this little home. So it says that this will be the first fragment loaded up when we interact with our navigation component. And we'll add our result fragment as well. So let me just drag it here. And now, as you know, we have a button inside our input fragment. And when we click on that button, I want to go to result fragment to see my results. So we need to add action to go from input fragment to result fragment. So when I click on this input fragment, you can see a little dot here. So click on that, and pressing the click, you can drag this little line and point it towards result fragment. So it will add action based on this. When you open the split code, and you can see this code is automatically generated. It has already added the fragment for us, and it has added that action which has an ID of action input fragment to result fragment, and the destination fragment here is result fragment. So that's it. We don't need to do anything else in the nav graph. So we can go back to our layout file of main activity. Let me just close everything. I mean, there are a lot of files open that we don't really need. Now we can go to activity main XML file. And here in the last video, as I talked about, we had to add few things, right? So now it makes sense to add in this video. So let me just have a name first. So by the way, this name will not be automatically popped up, so will not give you suggestions as well, but as long as you remember it, it's not a problem. So Android X dot navigation dot fragment dot nav host fragment. And as we can see, there is no red underline. That means we have spelled everything correctly, and that should be it. Now another thing will be default nav host, which we don't have directly. So let me just write app colon default nav host equals to true. And another thing will be nav graph, which we don't have directly in the suggestions. So app colon nav graph equals to that's a file that we created, right? So nav graph. So that's it. We don't need to do anything else. We have ID. Okay, so that's it. Now go to the Kotlin file of main activity. Here we first need to have the view binding. So let's create a variable for that, private let init var binding activity main binding, and below the super method binding equals to activity main binding dot inflate layout inflator, and in set content view I'll pass binding dot root. Okay, Now we have to have another, I'm sorry, this is the preview previously I showed on the first video. Anyway, private, we have to have another variable, private late init var, and this will be a variable for our nav controller of type nav controller. Now we have to initialize it. So before that, I have another variable here of nav host fragment equals to support fragment manager dot find fragment by ID and r dot ID dot nav host fragment container, or what was it? Nav host fragment, not container. So remove this container from the end. So nav host fragment, that's it. And as we need to have it as nav host fragment, so as nav host fragment. Now we can use this nav controller. Nav controller equals to nav host fragment dot find nav controller, and we can set action bar, set up action bar with nav controller, and we can pass this nav controller here. So that's it. Now we can go to our input fragment, and we have to add binding variable here as well. So private late init var binding of type fragment input binding, and here I'll have binding equals to fragment input binding dot bind, and we'll pass this view here. So now we can directly access this binding dot submit button, and I want to binding dot submit, and I want to call on click listener on this. And now I want to go to resolve fragment. So how do I do that? It's simple, one line of code. Just write find nav controller dot navigate, and we have to pass the ID of the action that we created inside our nav graph. So you write r dot ID dot it will give you the suggestion right away, action input fragment to resolve fragment. That's it. So you don't need to do anything else. Let's run our application and see if it is working. Okay, so I am getting an error. So this is basically the error. You have to be sure about the I didn't see this little underline. Actually is Android X, not Android X, Android X. So make sure you spell it perfectly, and now we can run our application. Okay, so our application is run, and as you can see, our input fragment loaded first. As in our nav graph, it was the home fragment, and when we click on this get result, it will take us to the result fragment. So and we click on the back button, it will take back to the input fragment. So the back stack is also handled by the navigation component itself. So this is how you include navigation component. This is how you use navigation component to load fragments. So let's recap what we did here. And so first of all, we created a nav graph. We had two fragments inside these. Let me just open the design. And we had two fragments inside this, and we created an action to navigate from input fragment to result fragment. Then inside our main activity XML, we created these 3 lines of code. Make sure you spell everything correctly, and if you don't spell it correctly, it will give you warning. The thing is, I didn't see that little underline which I should have. Anyway, then you pass that nav graph to this fragment container view. By the way, this is for container view, where every fragments on our application will be loaded through navigation component. So inside our main activity Kotlin file, we had our nav host fragment. We find that fragment by ID, and we had our nav controller, and we set up our action bar with nav controller. And in our input fragment in button click list, we simply call find nav controller dot navigate and we pass the action ID to it. So that's very simple, I guess. So that's it for this video. I'll see you guys in the next video. And before that, if you like this video, please give a like and please subscribe to the channel and press that bell icon so you get the notification whenever I post a new video. So I'll see you guys in the next video.